By late 1944, the relentless tide of the Pacific War had turned definitively against the Imperial Japanese forces. Their once mighty naval air arm was now severely depleted of both experienced pilots and modern combat aircraft. The industrial capacity of the United States continued to churn out ships and planes at an overwhelming and unsustainable rate. American forces had successfully executed the strategic island-hopping campaign, seizing crucial air bases and choking vital supply lines across the Pacific theater. The strategic planners in Tokyo faced a grim reality: conventional fleet defense was no longer a viable option against the massive resources marshaled by the American command. The vast, coordinated carrier battles that had once defined the war's early success for Japan were now a matter of painful history and memory. A desperate scramble for any tactic that could inflict a proportional, paralyzing blow on the enemy fleet became the singular focus of their military planning. The Japanese leadership urgently needed a way to neutralize the staggering technological and numerical superiority enjoyed by the U.S. Navy. They sought a weapon system that required minimal pilot training, bypassed sophisticated radar and anti-aircraft defenses, and maximized lethality against the heart of the American war machine, the aircraft carrier. This search for an asymmetrical advantage inevitably led them down a path of ultimate and final sacrifice. The emerging doctrine transformed the pilot himself into the final, guided, and inescapable munition for the attack. It was a chilling blend of cultural devotion to the emperor, military desperation, and cold, hard strategic calculus. Defeat was absolutely certain if the war continued along its current trajectory, necessitating a change in tactics that was both profound and morally shocking. This desperate moment marked a permanent shift from traditional tactical engagement to a national strategy rooted in sheer psychological terror and sacrificial commitment. The belief was that an unbreakable spirit could somehow overcome an insurmountable material disadvantage, a fatal flaw in their strategic assessment. The concept of the kamikaze, meaning divine wind, was formally introduced in October 1944 during the intense Battle of Leyte Gulf. This new military strategy offered a macabre and immediate solution to the Japanese military's crippling shortage of highly trained veteran pilots. These suicide attacks were meticulously planned, high-value strikes intended to sink or permanently disable the vital flat-top carriers powering the entire American war effort. A conventional bomb dropped near a ship could cause damage, but a fully fueled aircraft guided by a living pilot directly into the ship's superstructure guaranteed a catastrophic, system-paralyzing impact. The psychological dimension of the kamikaze was equally potent, as Japanese leadership hoped the sheer horror of facing suicidal pilots would break the American will to fight. Initial attacks were shockingly successful, demonstrating the terrifying vulnerability of the American ships to this unconventional and dedicated weapon system. Japanese officers, deeply steeped in the martial code of Bushido, viewed the kamikaze pilots as the purest form of spiritual warrior. Their actions were seen to embody the very highest ideal of selfless service and ultimate commitment to the empire and the emperor. This rigid mindset led many high-ranking Japanese commanders to completely dismiss the increasingly sophisticated American defensive tactics as cowardly or overly reliant on fragile technology. They sincerely believed that the fierce divine spirit of their sacrifice would ultimately overcome any mere material or technological advantage held by the enemy. This unwavering but strategically flawed conviction tragically blinded them to the rapid strategic innovations that the U.S. Navy was already implementing to counter the existential new threat. The initial scorn and mockery directed at American defensive methods would soon turn into a deep, bitter realization of their own massive and costly strategic folly. They completely underestimated the speed and dedication with which American forces adapted to and neutralized the intended psychological shock of the Kamikaze. The invasion of Okinawa in April 1945, codenamed Operation Iceberg, was to be the final, massive amphibious operation of the entire Pacific War. It served as the inevitable and stark backdrop for the ultimate clash between overwhelming naval technology and the height of suicidal fanaticism. The American fleet assembled for this single operation was historically the largest ever committed to a Pacific battle, a gargantuan force comprising countless warships and support vessels. Protecting this immense floating city was absolutely paramount, as any successful destruction would cripple the entire invasion and potentially force a major strategic withdrawal. The primary defense rested with Task Force 58, the powerful and fast carrier group, but even their extensive combat air patrols could not cover every possible approach vector. The vast expanse of the ocean surrounding Okinawa created natural, dangerous gaps in the essential air defense perimeter. These vulnerabilities were the precise areas that the kamikazes were expertly trained to exploit for their massed attacks. Japanese commanders correctly identified the critical importance of the main invasion fleet's anchorage areas and the landing zones. A successful, devastating strike here would irrevocably alter the course of the entire Allied campaign and buy precious time for the Japanese defense. The central problem for the American admirals was how to extend their defensive eyes and ears far enough out to sea. They needed to provide the valuable main fleet with sufficient reaction time against the expected massed air attacks launched from Kyushu and other Japanese-held islands. A traditional, close-in perimeter defense would require too many capital ships, pulling them away from their offensive duties and their mission to cover the landing troops. A new, specialized, and isolated solution was urgently required to fill this widening and strategically dangerous gap in the protective line. The innovative and specialized solution devised by the shrewd American strategists was the creation of the advanced radar picket stations. These stations formed a sacrificial, forward defensive ring position dozens, and sometimes hundreds, of miles away from the main fleet anchorage off Okinawa. These essential stations were established by converting older destroyer escorts and standard fleet destroyers into dedicated early warning platforms. The core of their operational capability was not their limited array of 5-inch guns but their powerful, long-range radar equipment. This equipment was capable of reliably detecting low-flying enemy aircraft from distances up to 100 miles or more out over the open ocean. They were deliberately placed on the most likely and direct enemy approach vectors, serving as isolated, forward-operating watchtowers for the entire fleet. The Picket's mission was deceptively simple but lethally dangerous: maintain their designated station, keep the powerful radar continuously sweeping, and transmit immediate, accurate warnings of incoming air raids back to the main fleet's combat information centers. This precious early detection was absolutely priceless, sometimes providing up to critical 15 minutes of warning time. This advanced warning was enough to launch additional fighter patrols, activate every anti-aircraft gun crew across the fleet, and maneuver the capital ships out of the direct line of attack. The picket ships were intentionally sacrificing their own immediate tactical safety to provide essential, life-saving strategic intelligence for the protection of the larger, more valuable vessels. Their exposed placement made them the most vulnerable and inherently dangerous positions in the entire theater of operations. This positioning guaranteed that they would be the first and most sustained targets encountered by every large, coordinated kamikaze formation. Serving aboard a radar picket destroyer was a unique and terrifying experience within the massive, multifaceted Okinawa campaign. The assignment was fundamentally defined by an extreme sense of isolation combined with constant, nerve-wracking, high-alert vigilance. These small, fast ships operated entirely alone or in small, paired patrols, far outside the protective, concentric rings of the powerful carrier groups. The crews understood the grim calculus. They were essentially bait, deliberately placed to draw the enemy's first, most concentrated fire. Their sacrifice was calculated to buy critical minutes for the much larger fleet they were sworn to protect with their lives. Continuous watches were mandatory, with exhausted crew members maintaining them for hours on end in the darkened combat information center. Eyes were perpetually glued to the oscillating, green sweeps of the radar screens, constantly searching for the telltale blips of the relentless incoming enemy raiders. The destroyers themselves were high-speed, maneuverable ships, but they entirely lacked the heavy armor or redundant systems of a cruiser or battleship. When a massive swarm finally appeared on the screens, the Picket station instantly transformed into a terrifying, high-stakes dueling ground. In this exchange, a single successful hit from a Kamikaze meant almost certain, rapid destruction for the small vessel and its entire crew. The deep silence between the sustained attacks was often more unnerving than the immense chaos of the battle itself, amplifying the sailors' acute awareness of their vulnerable position. This silence was always amplified by the sheer distance separating them from any friendly support or immediate rescue. Every sailor aboard the Picket understood that their ship was the sole barrier against a focused, large-scale attack on the main fleet. This realization made their task one of the most strategically vital and incredibly stressful roles in the entire U.S. Navy. The Picket destroyers were the lonely, vulnerable sentinels, the quiet, exhausted heroes bearing the absolute brunt of the most sustained and intense air attacks of the entire Pacific War. High-ranking Japanese officers, especially those within the senior command structure, initially viewed the American radar Picket system with a profound mixture of confusion and open contempt. Their dismissiveness stemmed from a fundamental and ultimately fatal misunderstanding of the system's true strategic value to the Allied forces. They perceived the radar destroyers as small, poorly defended ships operating in isolated, exposed positions far from their main combat strength. This placement led the Japanese to believe the Pickets were offering themselves up as seemingly easy, low-risk targets for the initial, less important waves of a kamikaze attack. The small physical size of the destroyers contrasted sharply with the massive American carriers and battleships that were their primary targets. This contrast led to the derisive notion that these small ships were unworthy, secondary targets that wasted a kamikaze pilot's ultimate sacrifice. Japanese pilots were routinely instructed to bypass these small buoys and press on with unwavering focus toward the high-value capital ships. However, the Picket ships' isolated positions made them tactically unavoidable and often too tempting for less disciplined or damaged enemy aircraft to ignore. This intellectual and strategic dismissal was deeply rooted in their own doctrine, which rigidly prioritized the dramatic, psychologically devastating strike against the most strategically significant enemy assets. They critically failed to grasp that the destroyer's primary purpose was not even its own self-defense, but the immediate, unfailing transmission of crucial information. The critical task of sending a warning was a mission it could successfully accomplish even while the ship itself was actively sinking. The Japanese leadership's immense arrogance about the spiritual superiority of their kamikaze doctrine blinded them completely to the reality of American technological efficiency. They did not understand that a single, clear radio message, sent in advance, was more than enough to completely nullify their critical advantage of surprise. They mocked the American reliance on technology they considered impersonal, not realizing that this same technology was the key to cracking the code of their ultimate sacrificial weapon. The kamikaze attacks launched against the Okinawa fleet were not simply sporadic raids but massive, meticulously coordinated operations codenamed Kikusu, or floating chrysanthemum. These operations involved hundreds of aircraft in successive, overwhelming waves, each focused on piercing the American defensive shield. These concentrated swarms descended upon the American perimeter with a terrifying and relentless intensity, always beginning with the picket stations positioned farthest out to sea. When a full Kikusu wave launched its planes, the distant picket ships instantly transformed from serene watchdogs into desperate, all-or-nothing fighting platforms within minutes. The sky around the lonely destroyers would suddenly fill with dozens of incoming, screaming planes, forcing the crew to engage in sustained, high-speed maneuvering. They were required to maintain continuous, maximum-rate anti-aircraft fire, burning through ammunition at a staggering pace. The total volume of explosive fire unleashed from the small ship's limited guns was immense, but the core kamikaze tactic was one of brutal, relentless attrition. This strategy banked entirely on the sheer quantity of synchronized attacks to completely overwhelm the scattered, individual defenders. The Picket destroyers were never truly expected to survive these brutal engagements unscathed, or often, to survive them at all. But their core mission was unwavering: to shoot down as many attackers as possible and, most importantly, to radio a continuous stream of updated targeting and positional data back to the main fleet. The immediate reality of a kamikaze striking a destroyer was horrifying, characterized by a massive, debilitating explosion, raging gasoline fires, and a severe, instantaneous loss of life and essential functionality. Yet, the critical transmission, warning, large raid inbound, had almost always already been successfully sent before the impact. This devastating exchange became the brutal, high-cost norm for the pickets, turning their solitary stations into the most brutal killing fields of the entire campaign. This sustained commitment was a testament to their unwavering dedication to their grim, strategically essential task. The true and enduring strategic value of the radar picket destroyers lay not in their firepower but in their unwavering capacity for calculated self-sacrifice. They functioned flawlessly as human and mechanical warning beacons that perfectly illuminated the kamikaze attack trajectory for the rest of the vulnerable fleet. A destroyer was structurally tough enough to absorb one, maybe two, direct hits from the explosive-laden aircraft before it was either sunk or rendered totally useless as a fighting unit. Yet, the very moment their radar screen filled with enemy contacts, the alarm was instantly raised across the vast network. This immediate, distant warning provided the American carrier commanders with precious time to scramble their own combat air patrols, CAP, into the sky. The warning allowed the CAP to be positioned on a clear interception course hundreds of miles from the main fleet's position. For the invaluable fast carriers, the few minutes gained by the Picket's imminent sacrifice were literally a matter of life and immediate death. This time was enough to effectively neutralize a massive portion of the incoming threat before it could ever reach the high-value ships. Many destroyers were tragically lost. In fact, the picket line sustained disproportionately high personnel and material casualties throughout the campaign. But every single ship that went down had successfully performed its critical duty, buying absolutely precious time and irreparably shattering the element of essential surprise. The entire fleet was warned, the CAP was launched, and the coordinated kamikaze swarm was fractured into much smaller, less manageable groups long before they ever reached their primary targets. The Picket destroyers were deliberately absorbing the greatest possible blow, and their grim success ensured that the damage inflicted on the main U.S. fleet was dramatically lower than Japanese planners had desperately anticipated. The relentless and intensely destructive nature of the Kikusu attacks quickly forced the U.S. Navy to adapt its defensive doctrine at an astonishing pace. This rapid strategic flexibility contrasted sharply with the Imperial Navy's rigid and unchanging commitment to the single-minded kamikaze tactic. Realizing the extreme and unsustainable vulnerability of the isolated destroyers, the Navy began strengthening the Picket stations with additional support ships. These new assigned vessels included small, heavily armed landing craft, LCS, and crucial dedicated fighter directorships. These combined reinforcements provided significant additional anti-aircraft firepower and, most crucially, essential radar redundancy in case of a Picket ship loss. This ensured that the loss of a single ship would never silence the entire warning station's vital broadcast. Picket tactics quickly evolved from simple line patrols to intricate, coordinated battle plans. These plans dictated immediate, high-speed maneuvers and established mutually supportive fire zones to maximize the collective anti-aircraft defense. The command structure also experienced critical improvement, with better, faster coordination between the Picket stations and the main fleet's fighter controllers. This improved process led to far more efficient and earlier interception of the incoming raids, often hundreds of miles from the main fleet. Furthermore, the Picket destroyers began operating in slightly closer proximity to each other, allowing for continuous mutual fire support. This new proximity made them significantly harder targets for the converging, disorganized swarms to successfully exploit. This immediate and decisive adaptation demonstrated the American military's unparalleled ability to rapidly learn, innovate, and overcome even the most desperate and unconventional new threat. The small destroyer, once mockingly dismissed by the enemy, now became the crucial focal point of a highly integrated, multi-layered defensive system that fundamentally changed the dynamics of the air war over Okinawa. The single most critical contribution of the radar Picket destroyers was not the total number of enemy planes they personally shot down in their immediate vicinity. It was their profound ability to systematically and successfully destroy the essential cohesion of the massive, coordinated kamikaze swarms. Japanese attack doctrine relied entirely on precise timing and coordinated mass to simultaneously overwhelm the target's defenses from multiple vectors. This complex strategy absolutely demanded the preservation of the critical element of surprise until the final moments of the attack. The crucial early warning provided by the distant Picket ships allowed the U.S. Navy to deploy its fighter patrols hours before the main targets were within striking range. The carrier-launched F-4U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats, guided unerringly by the Picket ship's radar, would intercept the kamikazes while they were still far over the open water. These intercepts forced the enemy aircraft to break formation, drop their coordinated attack plan, and often jettison essential fuel or unneeded weapons to survive the fighter attacks. By the time the fragmented, disorganized remnants of a swarm reached the main fleet's defense, they were no longer a unified, overwhelming, single force. Instead, they were scattered, individual, and frantic attackers who were tactically much easier for the fleet's heavy anti-aircraft batteries to manage and defeat. This strategic breakdown of formation dramatically lowered the overall lethality and effectiveness of the entire kamikaze campaign. The picket lines acted as a massive, abrasive, and inescapable filter, grinding down the intensity and coordination of the Japanese attacks. They successfully ensured that the divine wind would arrive over the target as a scattered, weak breeze instead of a destructive, focused gale. This complete strategic breakdown of coordinated timing was the ultimate, enduring answer to the existential kamikaze threat and a direct result of the destroyers holding their isolated, perilous stations. The statistics emerging from the brutal Battle of Okinawa tell a profoundly powerful and somber story of the sacrifice and effectiveness of the vital radar Picket system. The sheer numbers confirm the system's absolute strategic role in the ultimate defense of the entire invasion fleet. Out of the total number of American ships sunk or heavily damaged during the intensely contested 3-month campaign, an overwhelmingly disproportionate percentage were the small destroyer escorts and dedicated radar pickets. Specifically, more than a dozen destroyers assigned exclusively to picket duty were catastrophically sunk by enemy action. Scores more were severely damaged and temporarily taken out of service, representing a devastating casualty rate for this small and exposed segment of the fleet. These tragic losses stand in stark contrast to the comparatively lower losses sustained by the primary carrier groups and battleships. The operational data clearly demonstrates that the Picket destroyers were absorbing the brutal brunt of the massed kamikaze onslaught. They were successfully drawing the most concentrated enemy fire away from the immensely valuable and essential aircraft carriers and battleships. Furthermore, official U.S. Navy records indicate that the combat air patrols guided by the Picket ship warnings accounted for a vast majority of the total kamikaze kills over the distant ocean. This verifiable, calculated success demonstrated that the initial Japanese mockery of the system was tragically and strategically misplaced. The supposedly easy targets were, in reality, the tactically vital and essential linchpin of the entire American air defense network. The high casualty rate among the Picket crews was a horrific human price that was willingly paid by the sailors and their commanders. However, it was a necessary and calculated exchange that successfully preserved the operational capability of the main attack fleet. This ultimate sacrifice allowed the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War to proceed and to ultimately succeed in its core objective. The enduring legacy of the radar Picket destroyers is one of quiet, unheralded heroism and a perfect illustration of how tactical sacrifice can yield profound strategic victory in modern warfare. The Japanese officers who mocked them for being small, isolated, and overly reliant on impersonal technology fundamentally failed to grasp the larger picture. They failed to understand that the destroyers were never designed or intended to win the fight alone or to survive every attack. Their mission was to ensure that the main fleet was given every possible chance to win the war and to avoid a catastrophic, paralyzing defeat. These small buoys, once relegated to simple escort duty, became the most critical vessels in the theater of operations. They served as the unsung, essential guardians of the entire American fleet during the most sustained, focused air attacks in the history of naval warfare. Their collective and costly contribution fundamentally broke the back of the entire kamikaze strategy as an effective, decisive military weapon. They successfully turned what was intended to be an unstoppable force into a predictable, manageable, and costly nuisance for the main battle groups. The quiet bravery of the young sailors on these ships, who knew they were facing near-certain death for the sake of a single radio transmission, secured their lasting place as genuine heroes of the Pacific War. Their powerful and devastating story serves as a constant reminder that strategic success often depends not on the biggest guns or the heaviest armor plate. Instead, victory often rests on the courage to hold a vulnerable, exposed position and the sheer efficiency of the warning message successfully sent to others. The radar Picket destroyers paid the highest imaginable price but ultimately fulfilled their assigned mission with unwavering resolve. By their sacrifice, they utterly ruined the crucial cohesion and deadly element of surprise that the kamikaze swarms desperately needed to achieve any decisive, war-altering victory. The thin line of radar pickets proved to be the unbreakable and ultimate shield.